What if the African gods were more than myths? What if they weren't forgotten naturally, but erased on purpose? Have you ever stopped to wonder why so few people talk about African deities, gods that once shaped entire civilizations? Why names like Shango, Ogun, Yamaya, and Mawu are absent from history books, from sermons, from school lessons? Today, we begin a journey that might just change how you view history, spirituality, and yourself. For centuries, African gods weren't just symbols. They were powerful living forces, worshipped by kings, respected by warriors, invoked by healers, and feared by colonizers. Orishas, Vodans, and Kisis, these aren't just ancient names. They're spiritual codes, sacred legacies that colonialism, slavery, and religious domination tried to erase. But why? Because when you understand who these gods truly are, when you begin to reconnect with African spirituality, you unlock a powerful truth, a truth that threatened the systems of control, a truth that's been hidden for generations. African spirituality is one of the oldest and most profound systems of divine connection on the planet. Rooted in nature, the cosmos, and the spirit that dwells within us all, it speaks of balance, community, ancestral guidance, and harmony with the universe. It is a wisdom that predates empires and one that colonizers couldn't control. Have you ever wondered why so many rituals in Christianity or Judaism, baptism, incense, sacred chants, fasting, feel strangely familiar to African traditions? Because in many cases, they were borrowed, adopted, repurposed, and often whitewashed. There are documents, manuscripts, and reports hidden away, revealing undeniable links between African spirituality and stories we've read in the Bible. But don't expect this video to be a simple history lesson. This is not about dates and timelines. This is a revelation. If you've ever felt a spiritual void, if you've longed to know where your soul truly belongs, then you are exactly where you need to be. This is more than content. This is a calling. So don't watch this like you're watching just another video. Watch this like someone rediscovering a legacy buried under centuries of silence. Because together, we're about to rewrite what was erased. Before we dive in, I want to ask something of you. Drop a comment below. Share what you felt, what you've heard, or what you've lived related to African gods. Your voice matters. When you comment, you help break the silence and tell the algorithm and the world that this truth can't stay hidden anymore. If this resonates with you, hit that like button now. Subscribe to the channel. That way you'll be with us as we keep uncovering what was censored, forbidden, and forgotten. Now take a deep breath, because what's coming next? It might just change everything you've ever believed about God and about yourself. Let's begin at the root. Africa isn't just a continent, it's the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of culture, language, science, and yes, spirituality. Long before colonizers arrived, African peoples had developed complex, deep, and highly evolved spiritual systems. The Yoruba, Kemet, Ashanti, Bantu, these weren't just tribes. They were societies with rich cosmologies that connected the human soul to the divine, to nature, and to the stars. In these spiritual systems, every part of the world was sacred. The tree wasn't just a tree, it was a spirit. The river was alive. The drum was a form of prayer. Dance was an invocation. And the name of an Orisha, a Vodun, or an Nkisi wasn't just something you called on. It was something you could feel, hear, channel. African spirituality wasn't separate from daily life. It was daily life. It guided education, medicine, law, astronomy, ethics, everything. And here's what few will ever admit. Many aspects of ancient Judaism and early Christianity have traces of these African spiritual systems. This isn't just coincidence. It's the result of centuries of contact, influence, and yes, appropriation. But when colonizers arrived, they didn't just steal land and enslave people. They went after the soul. Temples were burned, priests were murdered or forcibly converted. Sacred rituals were banned. Symbols were labeled witchcraft. And the African gods, they were called demons. Let that sink in. Have you noticed that in many Western religions, everything dark, everything African, everything ancestral is associated with evil? That wasn't some innocent misunderstanding. It was a strategy, a spiritual manipulation. The colonizers knew that to truly dominate African peoples, they had to sever their connection to the divine. Because a person rooted in their spirituality cannot be controlled. A person who knows their gods cannot be enslaved in mind or spirit. The Bible itself has been rewritten, edited, and censored over centuries to support the narrative of those in power. Whole books were left out. Characters' names were changed or erased. Did you know Ethiopia is mentioned repeatedly in Scripture? Or that African figures play pivotal roles in major biblical events, yet we never hear about them? It's not that the African presence wasn't there. It's that it was deliberately erased. The African spiritual systems were dangerous to colonizers because they didn't require intermediaries. No priests, no popes, no colonial approval. They recognized the sacred feminine, the wisdom of ancestors, the voice of nature, and the divine spark within. Imagine if African people had held on to that power. Spiritually and culturally, they would have been unbreakable. And yet, the flame never went out. It was hidden, yes, but not destroyed. That's likely why you're here. Because something in you is remembering. Something is waking up. Maybe it's the call of Shango. Maybe it's Yamaya, Ogun, Oya. Maybe it's the whisper of an ancestor. Whatever it is, don't silence it. Don't fight it. Feel it. Because the more we reconnect, the more free we become. Many don't realize that African practices like baptism, purification with water, the use of incense, sacred chants, and fasting existed long before Christianity adopted them. Even the Ark of the Covenant may have roots in African symbology and traditions. This is not about rejecting belief. It's about expanding it. Understanding that the divine reveals itself in many forms, many names, many tongues, and that Africa was one of its first voices. For too long, we've looked at history through a European lens, as if truth only began in the West. It's time to change that. It's time to see African spirituality not as superstition, not as folklore, but as divine wisdom. If you've ever felt like your faith was missing something, like there was a deeper truth just beyond the edge of what you were taught, then this is your moment. Leave a comment below with the words, "Living Ancestry," if this has stirred something in you, or share the name of an African deity you want to learn more about. This is not just a comment, it's a declaration, a reconnection. Let's continue. When people hear the phrase African gods, many immediately think of mythological characters like Zeus or Odin, distant figures in stories. But African deities are different. They are living energies, they are nature. They are forces of the universe. They are within us. In Yoruba tradition, they're called Orishas. In Dahomey and Benin, Vodans. In Congo and Angola, Nkesis. These aren't gods in the Western sense. They are spiritual intelligences, deeply connected to the elements in the divine source. A supreme creator who exists in most African traditions, often ignored by European academics. Shango is not just a name, he is fire. Justice, the crack of thunder. Oshun is sweetness, water, fertility. Eshu is the crossroads, the messenger, the trickster that opens and closes doors. They are not far away. They are not in the clouds. They are in us, around us, reflected in our emotions, our choices, our personalities. When someone says she is a daughter of Yamaya, it means she carries Yamaya's strength, her depth, her calling. These deities represent frequencies of life, but colonial powers couldn't accept that. When they saw these rituals, drums, chants, dancing, possession, they didn't try to understand. They judged, they labeled, they called it witchcraft, paganism, devil worship, because they knew if you can destroy a people's gods, you can control their spirit. And so they rewrote the story. But what they called evil was actually divine. And now, finally, we are beginning to remember. What if the African gods were more than myths? What if they weren't forgotten naturally, but erased on purpose? Have you ever stopped to wonder why so few people talk about African deities, gods that once shaped entire civilizations? Why names like Shango, Ogun, Yamaya, and Mawu are absent from history books, from sermons, from school lessons. Today, we begin a journey that might just change how you view history, spirituality, and yourself. For centuries, African gods weren't just symbols. They were powerful living forces, worshipped by kings, respected by warriors, invoked by healers, and feared by colonizers. Orishas, Vodans, and Kisis, these aren't just ancient names. They're spiritual codes, sacred legacies that colonialism, slavery, and religious domination tried to erase. But why? Because when you understand who these gods truly are, when you begin to reconnect with African spirituality, you unlock a powerful truth, a truth that threatened the systems of control, a truth that's been hidden for generations. African spirituality is one of the oldest and most profound systems of divine connection on the planet. Rooted in nature, the cosmos, and the spirit that dwells within us all, it speaks of balance, community, ancestral guidance, and harmony with the universe. It is a wisdom that predates empires and one that colonizers couldn't control. Have you ever wondered why so many rituals in Christianity or Judaism, baptism, incense, sacred chants, fasting, feel strangely familiar to African traditions? Because in many cases, they were borrowed, adopted, repurposed, and often whitewashed. There are documents, manuscripts, and reports hidden away, revealing undeniable links between African spirituality and stories we've read in the Bible. But don't expect this video to be a simple history lesson. This is not about dates and timelines. This is a revelation. If you've ever felt a spiritual void, if you've longed to know where your soul truly belongs, then you are exactly where you need to be. This is more than content. This is a calling. So don't watch this like you're watching just another video. Watch this like someone rediscovering a legacy buried under centuries of silence. Because together, we're about to rewrite what was erased. Before we dive in, I want to ask something of you. Drop a comment below. Share what you felt, what you've heard, or what you've lived related to African gods. Your voice matters. When you comment, you help break the silence and tell the algorithm and the world that this truth can't stay hidden anymore. If this resonates with you, hit that like button now. Subscribe to the channel. That way you'll be with us as we keep uncovering what was censored, forbidden, and forgotten. Now take a deep breath, because what's coming next? It might just change everything you've ever believed about God and about yourself. Let's begin at the root. Africa isn't just a continent, it's the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of culture, language, science, and yes, spirituality. Long before colonizers arrived, African peoples had developed complex, deep, and highly evolved spiritual systems. The Yoruba, Kemet, Ashanti, Bantu, these weren't just tribes. They were societies with rich cosmologies that connected the human soul to the divine, to nature, and to the stars. In these spiritual systems, every part of the world was sacred. The tree wasn't just a tree, it was a spirit. The river was alive. The drum was a form of prayer. Dance was an invocation. And the name of an Orisha, a Vodun, or an Nkisi wasn't just something you called on. It was something you could feel, hear, channel. African spirituality wasn't separate from daily life. It was daily life. It guided education, medicine, law, astronomy, ethics, everything. And here's what few will ever admit. Many aspects of ancient Judaism and early Christianity have traces of these African spiritual systems. This isn't just coincidence. It's the result of centuries of contact, influence, and yes, appropriation. But when colonizers arrived, they didn't just steal land and enslave people. They went after the soul. Temples were burned, priests were murdered or forcibly converted. Sacred rituals were banned. Symbols were labeled witchcraft. And the African gods, they were called demons. Let that sink in. Have you noticed that in many Western religions, everything dark, everything African, everything ancestral is associated with evil? They weren't just spreading the gospel. They were enforcing submission. They were ordered to dismantle every spiritual connection Africans had to themselves. Temples were torn down. Altars were desecrated. Sacred texts like the Odu Ifa were dismissed as tribal nonsense. even though they contain entire cosmologies and moral codes as complex as anything in the Bible, Torah, or Quran. These texts weren't studied. They were ignored. And when studied, they were filtered through a racist lens. Instead of being treated as wisdom, they were labeled superstition. And here's the insult. In school, you can proudly study Greek mythology, but if you mention African mythology, you'll be laughed at. Treated like you're talking about voodoo dolls and curses. This is not coincidence. This is the continuation of erasure. In universities, African spiritual systems are often excluded from theology departments altogether. Why? Because they don't fit into European religious frameworks. Because they don't have cathedrals or popes or dogma in the same way. Because they challenge the monopoly on the sacred. But let's be clear, African spirituality is not primitive. It's profound. It's older than most world religions. It's dynamic, scientific, cosmic, communal. It explains life, death, the soul, nature, destiny, and the divine. And it's time the world gave it the respect it deserves. Now let's return to the gods themselves. Remember, these deities are not outside of us. They are within. They represent natural forces, yes, but also human qualities, emotions, gifts, and challenges. When someone is a son of Ogun, it means they carry the warrior spirit, the iron, the fire, the will to fight injustice. A daughter of Oshun carries sweetness, beauty, healing, but also deep emotional strength. A child of Eshu walks with communication, trickery, balance, the ability to navigate between worlds. These archetypes help us understand ourselves. They aren't gods in the Greek sense. They are mirrors of our own divine design. In African spirituality, you're not a sinner by nature. You're a being on a journey. You have a destiny, a divine essence. And through rituals, offerings, right living, you can align with it. This is radically different from the Western concept of guilt, punishment, and eternal damnation. Here, the focus is on balance, on living in harmony with nature, with the ancestors, with the spirit world. That's why it was so dangerous to colonial powers, because it gave people freedom, not just political freedom, but spiritual freedom, a freedom that no empire could contain. Let's pause for a moment. If anything in this part of the video has stirred something in you, if your heart feels a little more open, if your soul feels like it's hearing something it had forgotten, leave a comment with the phrase, "My spirituality will no longer be erased," or write, "I don't fear my roots. I honor them." This isn't just a comment. It's a spiritual declaration, a statement to the algorithm, a message to the universe. We are no longer afraid. We are no longer ashamed. We are remembering. Let's keep going. Because in the next part of this journey, we'll confront one of the boldest truths yet. Many of the most iconic spiritual rituals, practices, and even stories in the Bible were practiced in Africa first. That's not a theory. That's history. And once you see the connections, you won't be able to unsee them. The road ahead is deeper, richer, and even more revealing. Let's begin with a question no one wants to answer. What if much of what the world calls biblical actually has African roots? Not symbolically, not poetically, literally. This isn't about discrediting anyone's faith. It's about giving credit where it's long been denied. We've been told that history began in the Middle East, that civilization, wisdom, law, and religion were born there. But before Mesopotamia rose, before prophets walked deserts, before commandments were carved on stone, Africa was already ancient. Africa had spiritual systems, temples, and cosmologies thousands of years before the first Hebrew letters were written. Don't believe it? Let's talk Egypt. Kemet, as Egypt was originally called, was not just a land of pyramids. It was a spiritual superpower. Long before Moses was born, priests in Kemet were practicing rituals of purification, resurrection, and divine communion. They had concepts of the afterlife, of divine judgment, of a soul that must answer for its actions. Sound familiar? The 42 laws of Ma'at, written in Kemet over 3,000 years ago, outlined a moral code almost identical to the 10 Commandments, but far more detailed. Where Moses brought 10 rules, Ma'at taught 42 principles for how to live in truth, balance, and harmony. Examples: I have not committed sin. I have not stolen. I have not told lies. I have not polluted the earth. I have not closed my ears to the truth. These aren't suggestions. They're affirmations. Declarations of purity spoken by the soul before divine judgment. Now ask yourself, why don't we learn about Ma'at in school? Why aren't her teachings studied next to Moses or Jesus? Because acknowledging Ma'at means admitting that African people created divine law without needing Western religion to teach it to them. And that changes everything. Let's go deeper. The concept of resurrection, it existed in the story of Asar, Osiris, an African deity who was killed, buried, and resurrected by his wife Aset, Isis, and his son Heru, Horus, a divine father, a sacred mother, and a holy son. Sound familiar again? In fact, early Christian imagery of the Madonna and Child was directly modeled on Isis and Horus. The European Church even borrowed the iconography, a seated mother holding her infant son, because it was already deeply powerful in African spirituality. The symbolism worked. It was universal. But the source? African. And what about baptism? In ancient Nile Valley traditions, spiritual initiates were submerged in water as part of purification rituals. Baptism wasn't new, it was borrowed. Communion, offerings to the gods, sacred anointing oils, fasting, prayer facing east, all of it was practiced in Kemet, Nubia, and other African civilizations long before Europe had churches. We're not saying the Bible stole spirituality, we're saying Africa was already spiritual. But this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because when African spirituality influences European religions, it's called syncretism. But when Africans practice their own traditions, it's called paganism. See the double standard? Why is it acceptable to light candles in a cathedral, but suspicious to light a candle before an orisha? Why is it holy to pour wine during communion, but witchcraft to pour water to honor your ancestors? It's not about the act, it's about who's doing it. And that's the truth no one wants to talk about. Now let's talk about the Bible itself. In Acts 8:27, we read about an Ethiopian official, the first non-Jewish convert to Christianity. Not Roman, not Greek. Ethiopian. In fact, Ethiopia is one of the oldest Christian nations in the world. Long before Europe adopted the faith, but the Christianity practiced there was rich with African elements. Chanting, fasting, spiritual art, ancestor reverence. Even the word Christ has deep resonance in African systems. In Kemet, the word Christ referred to an anointed one, a person spiritually awakened after trials, purified in the womb of darkness, and reborn. Again, this is not coincidence. We're not saying Jesus was Egyptian. We're saying the spiritual framework to understand resurrection, divine incarnation, and spiritual awakening was already thriving in Africa. So why was all that hidden? Because if people realized African civilizations shaped global spirituality, then Africans couldn't be painted as savages. If the world knew African priests were writing sacred laws before Moses, then colonialism couldn't justify its so-called civilizing mission. And if African spirituality was respected, then millions of people today would reconnect with their roots. But here's the miracle. Despite all attempts to erase it, African spirituality is rising again. Young people across the diaspora are remembering. They're honoring ancestors, wearing beads, learning Yoruba, Twi, Kikongo, studying Ifa, embracing Vodun, returning to the sacred. They're realizing they don't need to reject Jesus to honor Shango. They don't need to abandon saints to venerate orishas. They can see the divine in multiple languages, because divinity is not exclusive. It's inclusive. It's ancestral. And for Africans, it's native. So why does this matter? Because spirituality is power. And the moment you reclaim your spiritual lineage, you become unshakable. When you know that your ancestors weren't heathens, but healers. When you know your lineage didn't begin with chains, but with kings, queens, prophets, and priests. When you realize your spirituality is older than oppression, you walk different. You stop shrinking, you stop apologizing, you start remembering. And when enough of us remember, we break the spell. Now take a breath. Let these truths settle in your spirit. You are not spiritually lost. You've been systematically disconnected. But disconnection is not the end. It's an invitation to return. If you've made it this far, comment, "My roots are sacred," or "I reclaim what was mine all along." This isn't just history, it's prophecy. It's your soul remembering itself. In part 4, we'll reveal how African spiritual systems didn't just survive, they evolved. We'll explore how they traveled through the slave trade, disguised themselves in Catholicism, and birthed powerful traditions like candomblé, Santeria, Vodou, and Hoodoo, right under the nose of oppression. The resistance was spiritual, and it was brilliant. Let's be clear about something that often gets left out of history books. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just a kidnapping of bodies, it was a war on the African soul. Millions of Africans were ripped from their homelands, stripped of their names, their languages, their families, their gods, and yet they brought their gods with them anyway. Not in chains, not in books, but in memory, in rhythm, in ritual, in the quiet prayers whispered beneath breath, in the dances performed at midnight, in the songs that held codes, names, and power. They were told, "Your gods are dead." But the truth, African spirituality refused to die. Let's start with West Africa, where many enslaved people originated. The Yoruba people had a complex spiritual system centered around orishas, divine forces of nature and personality. Each orisha represented not just spiritual power, but aspects of daily life. Oshun for love and rivers, Shango for thunder and justice, Yemaya for oceans and motherhood, Eshu for crossroads and communication. When these people were enslaved and taken to the Americas, colonizers tried to wipe out their traditions. But the Yoruba had a strategy. They didn't abandon the orishas, they masked them. They looked at the Catholic saints forced upon them and said, "This one? That's Oshun. That one? That's Shango," and so on. Out of this adaptation, new spiritual systems were born, syncretic religions that allowed African beliefs to survive inside the shell of Catholicism. Let's look at a few. Candomblé, Brazil. In the plantations of Brazil, Yoruba, Fon, and Bantu, traditions fused to create candomblé. It blended African rituals with Catholic saints, drumming, dance, and trance possession. It was illegal. People were beaten for practicing it, but they kept dancing, kept praying, kept honoring the spirits. They knew what most didn't. Their ancestors were still listening. Santeria, Cuba born from the Yoruba religion, Santeria, also called La Regla de Ocha, took root in Cuba under Spanish rule. Here, African gods were paired with Catholic saints as camouflage. Shango became Saint Barbara, both linked to lightning and fire. Oshun became Our Lady of Charity, both symbolizing sweetness and water. Yemaya was paired with Our Lady of Regla, protector of the seas. By honoring saints outwardly, enslaved people protected their true spiritual practices. It was brilliant resistance. Voodoo, Haiti. Let's be real, voodoo has been demonized by Hollywood for years. They show zombies, curses, dolls, and dark magic. But that's propaganda. True voodoo is a sacred religion. Rooted in the traditions of the Fon and Yu peoples of West Africa, it honors Loa, spiritual intermediaries between humans and the Creator. Rituals include dancing, drumming, spirit possession, healing, and ancestor reverence. Vodou isn't evil, it's ancestral memory in motion. In fact, Vodou was central to the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history. Warriors were spiritually initiated before battle. Ceremonies called on divine forces for liberation. So ask yourself, why would colonizers fear it so much? Because it worked. Hoodoo, United States. In the American South, enslaved Africans developed hoodoo, a powerful system of root work, herbal medicine, ancestor magic, and protective rituals. Unlike voodoo, hoodoo isn't a religion, it's a practice. A toolkit passed down in whispers and recipes. Red brick, dust to protect the home. Mojo bags for luck and strength. Psalms from the Bible spoken as incantations. Graveyard dirt, candle magic, and spiritual baths. Many Black families today don't even realize some of their old traditions are hoodoo, sweeping toward the door after a visitor leaves, putting salt in corners, avoiding walking over someone, pouring out liquor for the dead. These aren't just superstitions. They're encrypted spells of survival. Let's pause here. If African spirituality was really powerless or demonic, why did every colonial empire try so hard to erase it? Why ban drums? Why punish rituals? Why demonize ceremonies? Because they knew the truth. Spirituality is power. Power to organize, power to resist, power to remember who you are. And here's the most amazing part. Despite centuries of forced conversion, torture, surveillance, and demonization, African spirituality adapted and survived. It didn't stay locked in Africa. It grew in the Americas. It moved through music, through ritual, through dreams. Even today, if you've ever lit a candle for someone who passed, felt something shift in your spirit during a drum beat, had a dream so vivid it felt like a message, you've brushed against it. You don't need to be initiated to feel it, because it's already in your blood. We don't tell you this to romanticize the past. We tell you because your ancestors never stopped speaking, even in chains, even in secret. Even when they couldn't speak their gods' names out loud, they still whispered them in their hearts. And now, you are the generation that gets to say those names out loud again, not with fear, but with fire. If you're still watching, comment, "I am the prayer my ancestors whispered," or "The spirits didn't die, they waited." You're not just reclaiming rituals, you're restoring a legacy. In Part 5, we'll explore what African spirituality looks like today, in Africa, in the diaspora, and in the hearts of those waking up. We'll look at the revival, the resistance, and the reconnection happening around the world. The question now isn't, what did we lose? It's, what are we ready to remember? Let's begin where all true remembering starts, with the self. After all we've uncovered, the stolen names, the demonized deities, the disguised gods, the whispered rituals, one question remains. Now that you know, what will you do with it? Because African spirituality isn't just something from the past. It's something you carry in your voice, in your intuition, in your dreams, in your blood. Across the world, there's a movement rising, a spiritual awakening, not created in universities or institutions, but in kitchens, music studios, prayer rooms, and street corners. People of African descent are reconnecting with the very essence that was denied to their ancestors. They are learning, unlearning, relearning, and not just for curiosity, for healing. Because what colonialism destroyed outwardly, it also wounded inwardly. Shame, confusion, disconnection. For many, these are inherited wounds, but the medicine is in the remembering. In Nigeria, youth are returning to Ifa divination. In Ghana, traditional festivals honoring deities are celebrated with full public pride. In Benin, the once feared Vodun temples are now places of national pride. Across the Caribbean and the Americas, people are reclaiming Santeria, Vodou, Candomblé, and Hoodoo. They're re-establishing altars, relearning chants, reviving ancestral names, combining sacred texts with oral traditions, creating spaces where African spiritual systems are not only respected, but revered. This isn't a museum tour of lost religion. It's a resurrection, but not everyone will understand. Some will laugh, others will fear it, and some, conditioned by centuries of colonial thinking, will attack it. They'll call it backwards, primitive, demonic. But here's what they don't know. To return to your roots is not regression. It's revolution. You are not worshiping idols. You are honoring forces of nature, personality, and the cosmos that your ancestors recognized long before Rome ever rose. And this isn't just about deities. It's about reconnecting with the land, how your people grew food, healed with plants, and walked in rhythm with the earth. The ancestors, not just biologically, but spiritually. Those who walked before you, who guide from beyond. The self, your spiritual intuition, your ability to sense truth, energy, purpose. In African spirituality, you are not a sinner by nature. You are not broken needing to be saved. You are born with divine essence, with purpose, with A's. the power to speak and manifest. You are not separate from spirit, you are spirit. So what happens now? You don't have to throw away your current faith. You don't have to choose between this and that. Many African traditional systems are not exclusive. They're not about control, they're about connection. You can light a candle and pour libation. You can pray and drum. You can read sacred texts and still call your grandmother's ritual sacred. Because spirituality isn't about boxes. It's about balance. Reconnecting doesn't mean perfection. It means starting. Starting to ask, where did my people come from? What did they believe before the missionaries? What practices have I inherited and didn't realize? What spirits have waited generations for me to remember them? You don't have to know everything. You just have to be willing to listen. And when you're ready, you'll see the signs, a dream, a name, a symbol, a rhythm that pulls at your chest. And you'll know, they never left. You did, but you can return. So here we are, 5 parts later, and the truth is no longer buried. The gods weren't erased, they were renamed, repainted, repackaged. But now, they're being remembered. By you, by your generation, by those refusing to let the spiritual inheritance of an entire continent be lost to fire and colonization. Say this with me if you feel it. I return not to escape the present, but to remember who I've always been. If this video sparks something in you, a memory, a fire, a whisper, then it's already working. Your ancestors see you, the spirits hear you, and the gods, they remember your name. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, comment, "We are the ones who remember," and share this with someone who needs to hear it. The reclamation has begun.